Park Jimin, member of the most popular K-pop group of all time, BTS. In October 2018, he became the center of an international scandal, all for wearing a t-shirt. How did this happen? Hi everyone, and welcome to Intellectual K-pop Analysis. I'm a current graduate student who researches K-pop, fandom, and social media. I've published a study about BTS myself, and I'm an ARMY. This is a series where I explain what academic researchers and scholars are writing about K-pop in an easy-to-understand way. Today's video is about the 2018 Jimin shirt controversy. This video is about some pretty spicy and controversial stuff, specifically World War II history, so I've done my best to be thorough without making the video too long or complicated. If you think I've made any mistakes or left something important out, please feel free to leave a comment. Also, content warning for sexual abuse and just general war crimes. Before I begin, please remember to subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future. I will now give an overview of the video. First, I will give a timeline of events to explain what exactly happened. Then, I will briefly explain the history behind Japan-Korea tensions. Next, I will discuss the emergence of far-right movements in Japan and how they relate to anti-Hallyu protests. Then, I will explain how collective memory can be applied to the Jimin shirt controversy. Finally, I will conclude with what we can learn from this event. Now let's dive into the incident. In October 2018, an image of BTS's Jimin wearing a t-shirt featuring an image of the atomic mushroom cloud began circulating online. That cloud came from the atomic bombing of Nagasaki during World War II and was accompanied by the words patriotism, our history, liberation, and Korea in English. This ignited a worldwide media firestorm that started in South Korea and Japan, but eventually even mainstream Western outlets covered the incident. This eventually spiraled into digging up other controversial old images of BTS to fan the flames. So how did a t-shirt blow up into an issue of worldwide importance? My main source for this timeline is the White Paper Project, created by a group of ARMY who wanted to document the event. October 18, 2018. The image of Jimin wearing the shirt begins circulating on social media in Japan, but doesn't yet spark widespread outrage. October 30, 2018. South Korea's Supreme Court rules that the Japanese steel companies Nippon Steel and Sumitomo Metal Corporation must pay 100 million won each to 4 Korean men in compensation for their forced labor during World War II. South Korean media begins reporting on this story, with Jimin's shirt as an addendum. November 8, 2018. The shirt story has begun to make international headlines, and BTS's upcoming appearance on the popular Japanese program Music Station is cancelled amid the controversy. BTS's appearance on the very popular year-end program Kohaku Uta Gassen is also cancelled. At the same time, other controversial images of BTS start circulating. For example, a 2014 photo shoot for Sessi magazine in which RM wears a hat with a swastika, though the rest of the shoot was not Nazi-themed at all, as well as a tweet made by Big Hit Entertainment, BTS's record label, in 2015 to promote a photo book. The tweet had a photo that featured BTS members posing at the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. The photo book was never actually released, as Big Hit swiftly removed the tweet once they were alerted to the photo location and ceased all publication. Some also compared the flags on their stage at So Tai-chi's 25th anniversary concert to Nazi flags, but this accusation had no actual basis. November 12, 2018. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, an LA-based Jewish human rights organization that focuses on Holocaust research and remembrance, condemns BTS and Big Hit for mocking the past and demands a formal apology, leading to another round of media coverage, particularly mainstream Western outlets like Associated Press, New York Times, etc. November 13, 2018. Big Hit issues a formal statement refuting any affiliation with or support for fascist or Nazi ideology. They also apologize to victims of the atomic bombings, those who suffered under totalitarian regimes, and anyone disturbed by these events. Big Hit also promises to review wardrobe choices more carefully in the future, and reaches out to the Simon Wiesenthal Center and atomic bomb victims/survivors organizations. After this, the controversy mostly died out. While this incident had its controversy extend far beyond Japan, I will primarily focus on Japan-Korea relations in this video. So how did this incident cause such a wide ripple effect? To understand why, we will have to dive into historic tensions between Japan and Korea. Modern Japan-Korea tensions come from the Korean colonial period starting in 1910, when Japan unilaterally annexed Korea as a colony. Japan believed that it was the superior Asian race, whose mission was to civilize all of the inferior peoples of Asia and lead them to modernity, as a part of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Japan claimed this sphere would free other Asian peoples from Western oppression, but in reality it just replaced Western oppression with Japanese oppression. Many Asian countries were colonized by Japan, but Korea bore the brunt of the colonial burden due to its closeness to Japan and the fact that it was the first main colony of the Japanese Empire. Under Japanese rule, Koreans were not allowed to speak Korean in public, were given Japanese names, and were generally treated as racially inferior, second-class citizens. Those who resisted Japanese rule were imprisoned or killed. During World War II, Japan stepped up its colonial exploitation to unprecedented levels. It forced Koreans and other colonies into fighting for the Japanese Empire, forced men into hard labor for the war effort, and forced women into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers, referred to as comfort women. I don't want to get too into the specifics here, but I will link an excellent video by the channel Knowing Better that details Japanese war crimes and how Americans helped revise Japan's atrocious wartime history and allowed some Class A Japanese war criminals to go unpunished. For reference, Class A is the highest. Hitler would have been Class A if he was captured alive. Anti-Japan sentiment in Korea really began gaining momentum in the early 1980s, when Japan tried to revise its history textbooks to whitewash its role in World War II. But in August 1991, a former comfort woman named Kim Hak-soon gave the first public testimony about her experience as a sex slave in the Japanese military, and filed a lawsuit against the Japanese government. Her testimony brought to light that, during their internment, they suffered multiple incidences of psychological and physical torture and abuse. They were expected to service between 10 and 20 men a day without compensation or proper medical care. It is estimated that 70% of these women perished before the end of the war, and a large number of them never repatriated. Even those who survived and returned to Korea after liberation could not return to their normal lives, because physical ailments due to sexually transmitted diseases and bodily abuse were compounded by severe psychological and emotional traumas. In response to the increasing international pressure brought about by the testimonies of comfort women, the Japanese government denied wrongdoing by citing the 1965 Treaty on Basic Relations between Japan and the Republic of Korea, in which the South Korean government agreed not to demand further payment for the colonial period. Scholar Leo Ching points out that this justification, which persists in official discourse even today, ignores the facts that not only was the comfort woman issue suppressed, if not censored in the 1960s, but also a crime against humanity cannot simply be offset by diplomatic negotiations. A large source of the continued tensions between Japan and Korea is because while Japan has technically officially apologized for its war crimes several times, many consider these apologies either half-hearted, too little too late, or the Japanese government would then do something to negate its apology. Examples include denying Japanese involvement in wartime atrocities elsewhere, or having high-ranking government officials visit the Yasukuni Shrine where Japanese war criminals are buried, as well as regular soldiers. Because of this, Japan has apology fatigue, feeling that Japan has already sincerely apologized and expressed remorse, offered reparations, and that, furthermore, in 2015, the governments of Japan and South Korea signed a bilateral agreement resolving the issue finally and irreversibly. Therefore, the narrative that dominates the Japanese media is that no matter what Japan does, South Korea and other Asian neighbors will never be satisfied. If you would like to read more about Korea-Japan tensions, I suggest Ken Kimura's book, The Burden of the Past: Problems of Historical Perception in Japan-Korea Relations. This history paints a clear reason for why South Korea would react negatively to Japan or others invoking images of World War II, but that isn't what happened in the case of BTS and Jimin. So why would the image of an atomic bomb anger Japan? To explain that, we need to give some context about far-right anti-Korean movements and Hallyu in Japan. Although far-right Japanese movements existed before Hallyu, Hallyu sparked a vocal, far-right anti-Hallyu movement in Japan. This started when Korea began its open-door policy in 1998, which lifted Korea's ban on importing Japanese cultural products. The first wave of Hallyu in Japan started with the K-drama Winter Sonata in 2003 with a fan base of middle-aged women. The second wave of Hallyu in Japan marked a change from K-dramas to K-pop and those in their 20s to 30s, with groups like TVXQ, SJJD, BoA, and Kara achieving mainstream success. This shift also marked a change in distribution from TV networks to social media. Currently, the third Hallyu wave in Japan is primarily consumed via social media with a mainly teenage fanbase, with acts like TWICE and BTS being the most popular. Anti-Korean sentiment started during the first Hallyu wave in Japan as a response to Sonata fever, demonstrated by the 2005 publication of the manga Ken Kanryu, literally hating the Korean wave, the best-selling anti-Korea book of all time. This sentiment continued building for years and culminated in an anti-Hallyu protest outside of the Japanese broadcasting network Fuji TV in 2011. This successfully made future Japanese networks hesitant to air more Korean wave content, prompting the move to social media. A lot of anti-Hallyu and anti-Korean sentiment and harassment has been directed towards the Zainichi, who are resident Koreans whose ancestors were forcefully relocated to Japan during Japanese colonization of the country. To give an idea of the scale of anti-Hallyu protests during the first and second Hallyu waves in Japan, while the anti-Korean sentiment of the 2000s was widely seen as the product of the online subculture of a handful of extremists, it emerged in the following decade as a serious social issue offline. Specifically, a total of 349 marches in which anti-Korean hate speech was uttered occurred in Tokyo, specifically around the Korean embassy and in the Shin-Okubo district, also known as Koreatown, over the period from 2011 to July 2014. In response, Japan's National Diet, Japan's legislature, passed an anti-hate speech bill in 2016. These developments demonstrate that, although the number of Japanese individuals actually participating in anti-Korean hate speech marches may be relatively small, the societal impact of these actions is immense, for a larger group of Japanese anonymously watch and like content associated with anti-Korean protests, and silently support such protests even if they do not attend them. It's also important to note the demographics of anti-Hallyu protesters. The majority of these protesters are male, while the majority of Hallyu fans are female. This hints at another reason for the protests: Japanese men afraid of inferior Korean men stealing their Japanese women. This issue is compounded by Japan's low birth rate. But now let's discuss the real cause of these anti-Hallyu protests. According to scholar Hyungjin Lee, anti-Hallyu protests are caused by cultural elitism advocated by conservatives trying to prevent the intrusion of the inferior culture of a marginal country into a Western country. They claim that the Korean wave is a cultural invasion from a former colony and ethnic Koreans in Japan. To clarify, Japan has historically viewed itself as above all the other backwards Asian countries, and therefore a technologically superior Western state. Additionally, these protests come from a sense of economic insecurity. Japan has been considered the most economically advanced country in Asia for decades, but after the huge IMF economic crisis in 1997, Japan's economy has stagnated. Compounding this sense of national economic insecurity has intensified as Japan has watched neighboring countries, especially Korea and China, become increasingly prominent in the global economy and their cultures become increasingly influential. It follows, then, that anti-Hallyu protests aren't really about Hallyu itself, but about the fear of losing to a backwards former colony of Japan. As An and Yoon write, anti-Korean groups had exploited the popularity of the Korean wave as a means to attract attention while, in reality, they were simply denouncing Korea and Koreans rather than critiquing Korean popular culture specifically. Thus, whenever relations between Korea and Japan are strained politically, there is usually an increase in anti-Hallyu protests to voice far-right Japanese dissatisfaction with Korea and Koreans. This is one reason why Jimin's shirt incident grew so huge. It was turbocharged by the Korean Supreme Court ruling that 2 Japanese steel companies had to pay huge fines for the forced labor of Korean citizens in the colonial era, agitating far-right Japanese nationalists. Now that we have the background history for Japan-Korea relations, we can discuss some deeper reasons for the reactions to Jimin's shirt in Japan, Korea, and abroad. These reactions center around the different collective memories of Korean and Japanese people about the atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Collective memory is the social representations or shared knowledge of a past that may not have been personally experienced, but rather is collectively constructed, transmitted, and recalled by members of a society through formal and non-formal communications. Collective memory can be disseminated via institutional channels such as official history textbooks, national commemorations, rituals in museums, and at a grassroots level, through popular cultural products, mass media, and interpersonal storytelling. A group's representation of history defines its sense of its past and future selves and therefore becomes a critical component in the construction of its identity. Some scholars describe Japan's collective memory of World War II as selective historical gaze, choosing only to remember certain parts of World War II. What this means is that South Korea and Japan have different interpretations of the same war history and distinct narratives attached to those histories. These competing narratives of the past play a critical role in prolonging the conflict and fueling tensions between the two countries. South Korea's general narrative about World War II has been explained in the history section of this video, so how do the Japanese remember it? Today, Japanese historical education on World War II focuses on the tragedy of the atomic bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Many Japanese think of Japanese civilians as the primary victims of World War II, rather than those who were colonized or lost their lives brutally to the Japanese military. To be clear, the atomic bombings of Japan were a horrific tragedy, but both Japanese and American elites purposefully made this the central focus of the Pacific theater of World War II's history to distract from the many war crimes committed by the Japanese military. Japan did this for obvious reasons, and America helped promote this narrative because they needed the American public to sympathize with Japan after viewing them as enemies during the war. This is because Japan became a crucial ally against communism when the Cold War started. Thus, Japan mobilized its new image as a pacifist nation to reassure its allies in the West that it was no longer a threat without having to come to terms with and remember its past war crimes, like Germany did. Put another way, focusing on an in-group's own suffering rather than its harmful actions against others helps defend the moral identity of the in-group. In this way, both perpetrator and victim groups can construct and perpetuate competing narratives of their own victimization. So, South Korea and other nations colonized by Japan celebrate the defeat of the Japanese Empire and consequently the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as Liberation Day, freeing them from the oppression of the Imperial Japanese government, as seen in the words on Jimin's shirt. However, the Japanese view the atomic bomb exclusively as the worst, most horrible moment of Japanese history, which it is, but neglect the other side of the coin, that it also freed its colonies from a horrible, oppressive colonizer. Exclusively focusing on the atomic bombs as hurting Japanese civilians and ignoring the liberation of Japan's colonies, as well as the colonial subjects forcibly relocated to Japan who also lost their lives to the atomic bombs. This comes off as a "sorry we lost the war" in our colonies, rather than a "sorry we hurt you" to those that Japan hurt in the war. Therefore, Jimin's shirt was not controversial in the Korean media, even receiving some praise. However, the shirt issue agitated the anti-Korean far right in Japan, receiving critical coverage and demands for apologies to victims of the atomic bomb. The loud far-right crowd in Japan, silently supported by those liking their posts, was able to spread outrage about this event within Japan that eventually reached Western media. The Western media generally agree with the framing of Japanese civilians as the primary victims of World War II, partially to educate about why we should never use nuclear weapons again, and partly as a remnant of Cold War propaganda. Like I explained in my Chewy video, think about the politics of apology at play here. Who is apologizing to whom, and for what, and how does that reveal who has power? In Japanese as well as American education, the predominant narrative is we, Americans/allies, should apologize to Japan for using the atomic bomb. The narrative of Japan should apologize to its former colonies for its crimes against humanity is really only circulated in former Japanese colonies, and sometimes not even then. To be clear, I agree that the atomic bomb was a humanitarian tragedy that should never be repeated. I think it was a shameful moment for the US and an understandable point of historical trauma for the Japanese. I also think it's possible to understand two things at once: that the atomic bombings freed Japan's colonies from horrible, repressive Japanese rule, making them a moment of celebration for those who suffered, while also understanding that it is a horrific mass loss of human life that should never be repeated or taken lightly. While I don't just want to repeat the same conclusion that I did in my video on the Jui incident, this event does also illustrate a lot of the same points I made in that video. Namely, the multitude of forces at play in politicizing idols in East Asia and the role of nationalism in all of this, so check it out if you're interested. What Jimin's shirt shows is that Japan is mainly irritated by perceived Korean insensitivity to Japan's own symbols of suffering and trauma, while Korea feels the same way about Japan's insensitivity. This reflects the main underlying reason for Japan-Korea tensions: the unsettled historical trauma of the Japanese Empire and its legacy. Victims of the Japanese Empire never got the same amount of closure as victims of Nazi Germany did from the government. For example, in Germany, it's illegal to produce, distribute, or display symbols of the Nazi era, and Holocaust denial is also illegal. The German government has apologized to the victims of the Nazis repeatedly and makes sure to educate all of its citizens about the horrors of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust. Contrast this to Japan, where flying the imperial flag is accepted and even flown on Japan's Navy and self-defense force. They whitewash their actions in history textbooks and consistently undermine their official apologies with contradictory actions. Additionally, some high-ranking Japanese military officials, including the imperial family, were granted immunity for political reasons by the US military. The US also helped spread the narrative of Japan as a victim of World War II rather than as an aggressor. Thus, the US is also in some ways culpable for the current Japan-Korea tensions. Meanwhile, the Japanese have apology fatigue, feeling like they have apologized sufficiently multiple times, and no matter what Japan does, South Korea and other Asian neighbors will never be satisfied. Not only that, the attention and outrage surrounding Jimin's shirt was heightened thanks to social media, where those opposed to harmony can rely on outrage as tinder to spark interest and to create a sense of the other as irrational. These online firestorms reveal a serious problem with social media circulation, as the attention economy finds its least common denominator in sensational headlines that play to affect and give power to shrill voices, even if lonely. Commentators wanting to disseminate a sense of Japan as an implacable enemy to South Korea seek to dredge up negative Japanese posts about what many Koreans view as patriotic acts from their fellow countrymen, while those who wish to demonstrate Korean irrationality in turn point to violent responses that show that Koreans cannot be reasoned with. Indeed, social media gives nationalists the ability to bicker back and forth globally and have it picked up at times by less than responsible media outlets who take the role of bystanders egging on a schoolyard fight. Unfortunately, what this ultimately means is that the transnational careers of Hallyu stars are in the hands of antagonistic nationalists who troll the internet, sign boycott petitions, and show up for protests. Thus, the Jimin shirt incident is indicative not only of historic Japan-Korea tensions and conflicting collective memory, but also of a problem with the wider social media and journalistic ecosystem. This video's explanation and analysis can be applied to other K-pop scandals involving Japan-Korea historical tensions too. For example, SNSD Tiffany's Snapchat filter scandal or Twice Sana's Heisei era controversy. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. What do you all think? Do you have any other questions or need more clarification on anything we've covered? Please leave a comment. I also welcome any nicely worded constructive criticism on my video, so please let me know if you have any. All the sources are linked in the description as well as my social media. That should be all for now. Bye!